Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee's online worship service. I'm Reverend Dina McFeeters, and I'm honored to serve as Associate Minister. We welcome people of all genders, sexualities, ages, races, ethnicities, histories, and bodies. We welcome your mind, your heart, and your spirit. We welcome all that you are carrying with you today and all that your heart longs to set down. We'd like to pay a special welcome to guests who are joining us today. If you are visiting for the first time or joining us from afar, why don't you say hello in the chat and tell us where you're joining us from? I'm delighted to introduce our pulpit guest, First Church member Kevin Gibson. Kevin and his family have been members of our congregation for over 20 years. Kevin grew up in England, where he served in the British Army before doing his undergraduate degree. He spent a year in the United States as an exchange student, where he met his sweetheart, now his wife, Elizabeth. He subsequently worked in a variety of fields, including driving a double-decker bus and operating the spotlight at an ice show, before writing his PhD thesis on the jurisprudence of alternative dispute resolution. He recently retired as Professor Emeritus after teaching philosophy at Marquette University for 25 years. Kevin, it's great to have you in our virtual pulpit this morning. I welcome everyone to our worship service by inviting you to repeat our mission after me. We gather to nurture the spirit, engage the mind, and inspire action.
Good morning and welcome. My name is Kevin Gibson, and I have the honor to be your pulpit guest today. It's the 4th of July, and as an immigrant and naturalized citizen, today holds special meaning for me as we celebrate the many freedoms afforded in America. One of our fundamental freedoms is the exercise of religion, where we can choose to believe and worship as we wish, to one God, many gods, or no God at all. We're free to voice our views, understanding that others will defend our right to disagree. So as we come together today, we remember our freedoms and at the same time realize that the promise of America is still a work in progress. As Martin Luther King Jr. observed, every person of goodwill in this nation is called upon to work passionately and unrelentingly to realize the American dream. And the persons who are working to do this are not dangerous agitators, they're not dangerous rabble-rousers, but they are the persons working to save the soul of America.
Dear ones, because of the unprecedented times in which we are living, and the ways that our lives are touched by the grief and loss of this global coronavirus pandemic, we are continuing our pandemic practice of lighting the COVID candle for any of our members who have had a loved one die during this period, either from COVID or another cause. If you have had a loved one die from coronavirus or another cause during this time and would like the COVID candle lit for them during Sunday worship, please contact one of the ministers. Friends, we have reached another grim milestone. Over 600,000 people have died from COVID-19 in the United States. It is our practice to light our COVID candle at each 100,000 mark in the devastating death toll of this pandemic. Today, we light our candle to remember the lives and the deaths of the over 600,000 people in the United States who lost their lives to COVID-19.
Today's meditation comes from Meeting the Messiah by Jeffrey Siminkowitz. When we scale at last the walls which our hardened hearts have built, then we come face to face, finally, with the blessedness of one another. Then we see that these struggling fellow pilgrims with whom we share this space are no longer robbers, pirates, and thieves, but deepest friends, most intimate souls. To see this creation with the eyes of God means seeing with the eyes of peace. It means finding ways to bind up the broken, even when the world says it can't be done. To scale these walls of alienation and despair means living our lives in truth, with justice, neither denying the holy gifts of our hearts and souls, nor hoarding them like miser's gold. 'Tis the simplest call of all, in essence. To open ourselves to God, we first open ourselves to one another. Each day we live, in hope, the deepest possibilities of our dreams and of our visions in this life. We dwell as well in heaven. Then it is that we will turn and greet one another, knowing at long last the simple blessing of standing fully in the presence of one another, true Messiah, face to face with one like us, a beaming, holy child of God.
Friends, what sort of God do you want?
Initially, I need to make a few disclaimers. I'm a philosopher, not a theologian, so I'm not going to be talking about faith, and I'm not going to try and undermine anyone's beliefs. Rather, what philosophers do is to examine concepts and analyze arguments. Generally, we don't search for meanings as such, but instead look at how a term is used in practice. For example, we look at how a term like human rights or justice is used across the literature, and then see if the ideas presented link together in the way that they are claimed. The term God and the concepts behind it don't get much bigger. Now, I won't be talking about the existence of God. As the Unitarian Robert Fulghum says, arguing whether or not God exists is like fleas arguing whether or not the dog exists. Arguing over the correct name of God is like fleas arguing over the name of the dog. And arguing over whose notion of God is correct is like fleas arguing over who owns the dog. Rather, I want to approach the question by pointing out that what we believe or don't believe about God and the way God functions can have a deep effect on our lives. My aim this morning is to look at some of the functions that God is said to have and ask if they cohere together. Again, I won't really be drawing on scripture, but only asking a few questions along the way. And although my own views may seep through, I'm not pushing any particular perspective. As a school child in Britain, where I grew up, we had a state-established religion, the Church of England, and every morning at school we would have an assembly and a brief morning service. It would often include the Christian hymn by Walter Chalmers Smith, which starts, "Immortal, invisible, God only wise, in light inaccessible, hid from our eyes, most blessed, most glorious, the Ancient of Days, almighty, victorious, thy great name we praise." It goes on. "Unresting, unhasting, and silent as light, thou rulest in might. We blossom and flourish as leaves on the tree, and wither and perish, but naught changeth thee." Consider those attributes for a moment. An invisible, eternal, dominating, interventionist, unchanging, supernatural being. If we started with a blank slate and an open mind, without any revelatory literature, is this the sort of God that we would discover? To put it another way, what purpose does God potentially serve in our lives? The short answer is that the concept allows us to make sense and give meaning to our existence. Naturally, though, when we start those existential inquiries, it turns out that what we're looking at are different aspects of our lives. Where do we come from? What sort of moral code should we live by? What happens after death? How do we explain the unexplainable? To begin then, let me suggest some of the functions of God that we find in Christianity. Creator, designer, monitor, nurturer, tester, judge, redeemer, martyr, punisher, and host of eternal life. Moreover, God is used as the universal explanation for mysteries, but more of that later. At first glance, we can see that these roles can be very distinct. The designer of the universe doesn't have to then be the one who redeems sins or the punisher of transgressions, for example. Let's look at a few of these functions more closely. At the outset, we have God the Creator. This is something that goes by the name of the fancy Latin title sui generis, or the prime mover. The idea is this: everything has a cause, and the cause happens before the effect. So if we go backwards, we can follow the chain from effect to its cause, and then ask what caused that, and keep going until we feel that we finally have to stop somewhere, and we call that the first cause, the thing at the root of everything else, or God. The question then arises, if God created everything, who created God? The Latin phrase means that it comes about by itself, and so God is the one and only thing that didn't need a prior cause. There is a correlate in physics where, if we take things back to the Big Bang, the singularity that starts the whole universe expanding is there, and this is used as a proof of God through science. But think about it. Let's concede that there was some primal event. That doesn't by itself lead to a supernatural entity that was the first creator. The next one is God the designer. The argument here is that the universe is so complex and so ordered that there must be some intelligent design at work, even if we can't discern it. The notion is that if you were walking along and came across a clock in a field, you wouldn't assume that it occurred naturally, as it's so different from everything around it, and there are complicated and apparently manufactured parts that work in concert. Fair enough. The argument says if they're not there by accident, there must be a designer and a builder. But can we really say the same of the universe? The deist design argument has to take one of two forms. First, that it's a machine which, like clockwork, was wound up and set in motion so that whatever subsequently evolves happens without further intervention. The second is that the designer had a perfect design, and any flaws that come about, say humanity engaging in wars or environmental degradation, are actually part of that design. So even if we concede design, that doesn't mean that the designer is benign or omnipotent. After all, we still have to account for mosquitoes and childhood cancer as part of the package. As a friend recently reminded me, in Genesis, God looks back at creation and grades it between good and very good, but not perfect. Think of Noah's flood. Was that the designer saying that there was a flaw that merited a mulligan? Or is it that this was all part of the original plan from the outset? The clock analogy that many proponents of intelligent design use forces a comparison between an organic and evolving entity on the one hand and something that's purely mechanical. And of course, they're not necessarily the same kind of thing. Perhaps to understand it better, we would need to compare our world with other worlds and judge whether the complexity is really due to a designer or the result of chance over almost incomprehensible amounts of time. My lifetime being something like 2/1,000,000% of the age of the Earth, or to put it another way, life appeared about 550 million years ago, and if we were to imagine each year to be represented by a single second, that would put us in the late teens. All in all, there's been lots of time for evolution and adaptations to happen along the way. There are natural psychological considerations in thinking that the world is designed, though. As some put it, we may only see the back of the tapestry, where there are loose threads and odd shapes, but once we're able to see the other side, it would all come to focus. This is the same sort of idea that people draw on when they say everything happens for a reason, or it's all part of a greater purpose. Suffering may be designed to be a means to make us stronger, or a path to redemption and salvation, elements that don't seem to make sense at first glance, but might if we could see things more clearly. But let's accept this belief for what it is, an articulation of faith or a mental construct. Moreover, think of the times when people, with the best of intentions, have tried to comfort you in this way. Has it been effective when they tell you that bad things aren't so bad after all, as they happen as part of a benevolent grand design, or that you are never given burdens you can't carry? Now, it could be that the world is a moral proving ground and that we're here to show ourselves worthy of salvation after death. The test we're facing is to develop attributes that show us worthy, and the baseline bar is to be decent according to a revealed standard. Hence, one way to escape the idea that anything goes in morality is to appeal to a foundational set of rules, which apply across all human time and space, and clearly 10 of those are presented in the Old Testament. Those are worth examining in their own right, but an open question is whether any reasonable godless society would have come up with something similar. Do not murder, steal, or lie, and so on. As a quick aside, an interesting thing about those 10 is the first 4 are about exclusively there being one God, no others, no graven images, and not taking God's name in vain, which may tell us something about this version of God's petty, jealous, and demanding nature. It also shows us something about the historical context of the rise of monotheism in an environment of many gods and goddesses. And in fact, many faiths maintain that our main purpose in life is simply to worship our Creator. But beyond that, in the classical Jewish tradition, there are actually 613 commandments, many of them seemingly culturally bound and odd to contemporary secular ears. For many people, God acts as a monitor of our behavior, like a divine parent or corrections officer, where not just behavior, but our every thought, word, and deed is recorded in a celestial ledger. That's a tough way to live, admittedly. On the other hand, the rules can be interpreted, and hopefully an all-knowing God might be sympathetic with my individual motives. According to this view, the reason to behave well is that the good person will be judged worthy to take a place in a heavenly mansion, whereas the bad will be condemned and suffer accordingly. With some consolation in that view, as it holds the promise of evening out some of the apparent injustices in this world, because there will be an appropriate comeuppance in the next. My mother certainly believed that the celestial police see you when you're sleeping and see you when you're awake, like a relentlessly judgmental Santa Claus. In retrospect, it probably made her more responsible and helped her to resist temptation. On the other hand, it seemed to me that she valued some rules more than others, including some that weren't really evident in the scriptures. To my young eyes, her view of godliness meant that heaven was going to be a very neat place, with no towels left on the floor, and everyone's teeth would be well brushed. We might also note the language of ruler that's often used: Lord, Prince, Mighty One, and indeed King of Kings. The rules don't have to make sense to us. They're simply the laws imposed by a supreme authority, and transgression is automatically a crime worthy of punishment. A gentler version of this is found in the shepherd, one who tends to the flock, who, quote, err and stray like lost sheep. To follow the analogy, we may not be aware of what we're doing wrong, but can look for divine guidance to help us. Another function is the Redeemer, and following different perspectives, we may either be the recipients of divine grace that will save us no matter what we do, as long as we maintain a personal relationship with God, or alternatively, we may have to earn our way to heaven through good works here on earth. But the basic idea remains the same. We are the inheritors of some kind of original sin and need to be cleansed. Some views of redemption say that we need to confess, be contrite, and ask for forgiveness from God before it's possible. It is God who offers redemption, and by some interpretations, all sins are ultimately sins before God, and therefore those harmed need not be addressed. The Redeemer has preemptively made atonement for those sins by self-sacrifice, as in Jesus Christ in human form. But the key to finding forgiveness is confession either to a priest or directly to the deity. Now, death is a reality for all of us, and confronting our own mortality can be daunting, to say the least. One of the promises of a God is resurrection and eternal life. And in the words of the New Testament, death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? Believers will be raised from the dead in a changed and incorruptible form. Again, there's comfort to many in the belief that this life is not all there is, and there may be some kind of continuity to our journey. Just as we aren't aware of where we came from, whatever is beyond may be outside our human comprehension. The function here, then, is to conquer the fear and denial of death. And after death, there's a caricature we've heard of ascent into heaven, where we're given wings and a harp and then partake in a never-ending church service accompanied by our long-lost relatives. On the other hand, heaven is considered the dwelling place of God, and those in heaven share the serious divine nature, which certainly by one view is becoming one with eternal love. Finally, God has functioned as an explanatory device. When rational explanations fail for things we observe, otherwise other unexplained phenomena are attributed to God by default. God moves in mysterious ways, and indeed we have the phrase act of God built into our social and legal frameworks. However, we should note that the fact that we can't explain things doesn't by itself underwrite the notion that there is an intelligent and benign being looking after our welfare. What does this catalogue of functions tell us? I'm certainly not trying to undermine a belief in anyone's faith, challenge their personal relationship with God, or dispute that there is wonder and mystery in the world. It's hard to be alive and not sense love, joy, and wonder in our existence. It is in our psychological DNA to try to build a coherent understanding of our relationships and explain how we came to be, why we're here, and what happens once the body ceases to be alive. Still, there is value in using logic not to analyze faith itself, but some of the inferences that people make that can have huge consequences. As an analogy, think how the phrase, "the poor will always be with us," might lead to the conclusion that we shouldn't bother to help them. You could reason that way, but there's a whole lot of steps and intermediate deductions that you have to make to get there, showing that even if you accept the initial claim, it isn't a direct and obvious line to the conclusion. That's what I'm doing in parsing out the functions and purposes of God. All the claims I've listed, and many more, might be true, or just some of them, or none of them. I personally would like to think there's some reason for apparently unnecessary pain and suffering all around. I'd like to think that death is not the final curtain, and take genuine joy and wonder in those I love and my encounters with the world. But the point is that the functions are distinct. Accepting that there may have been a designer does not necessarily give us a personal God who cares about my personal welfare. Prayers to the eternal for individual favors may not be heard by a creator long gone, or ancient rules about burnt offerings may not affect my personal prospects of eternal salvation. There is nothing amiss with having a personal faith and beliefs, but importantly, we have to be very careful in asserting their implications. We could believe, along with Rabbi Kushner, that God is benevolent but not all-powerful, or perhaps God didn't create a perfect world. Maybe we need a reconciler God that allows us to come to terms with the world as it is. So, what sort of God do you want? What does your God do for you? As it turns out, arguing the existence or non-existence of God isn't a fruitful discussion. What is more helpful is to see the ways the term is used in everyday life, and perhaps more importantly, see if claims about one function justify others. I don't know the meaning of God as such, but I see the ways in which people embrace it or deny it. There are many functions we can attribute to God, and a single God could conceivably take on all those roles. However, and this is my main takeaway, we can't easily infer one function from another and draw unwarranted conclusions. If we're going to attribute qualities, we need to connect the dots. My fear, a real fear as it has direct social and political implications, is that basic claims like the clock analogy are taken to unjustified extremes. For example, we could have a designer, but there's no direct line that tells us that Armageddon is part of that plan. We can have mysteries we can't explain, but that doesn't invalidate the science that we do have. And while some believe in commandments as foundational, that doesn't warrant undermining democratic governance. We are warned about false prophets, but faulty reasoning like this is pernicious. It can be misused to jump to weighty conclusions without doing the hard work of assessing the links in the chain to see if one follows from the other. So, let's not treat God as the last word in an argument or as a universal explanation. Let's explore what's going on when we hear that word, and ideally, our curiosity will lead to greater understanding.
There stands a misty mountain in the soft and gentle rain, against the flight of endless time, forever to remain. Through all the passing seasons, through every night and day, I can see that misty mountain and hear the Spirit say, "Oh, brother, don't you weep. Oh, brother, don't you weep no more. The sun's gonna shine on a golden shore. Oh, brother, don't you weep. Oh, sister, don't you weep. Oh, sister, don't you weep no more. The sun's gonna shine on a golden shore. Oh, sister, don't you weep. Up the rocky roads of trouble, down the twisted paths of pain. Sometimes it is a struggle, sometimes we come up lame. But with children on our shoulders, we will face another day. And their shining eyes of innocence, I can hear the children say, oh, Father, don't you weep. Oh, Father, don't you weep no more. The sun's gonna shine on a golden shore. Oh, Father, don't you weep. Oh, Mother, don't you weep. Oh, Mother, don't you weep no more. The sun's gonna shine on a golden shore. Oh, Mother, don't you weep. So when there's music all around you and you just can't seem to hear, when the answer's just around the bend but it never shows up clear, when there's darkness right above you, it's hard to know and understand, but there's a heart out there that loves you, there's a promise in your hand. So oh, people, don't you weep. Oh, people, don't you weep no more. The sun's gonna shine on a golden shore. Oh, people, don't you weep. Oh, people, don't you weep. Oh, people, don't you weep no more. The sun's gonna shine on a golden shore. Oh, people, don't you weep.
Thank you all so much for your generosity. Pledges are the core of our church's spiritual practice of generosity. We are also grateful for additional gifts to support our ministry and thank the folks out there who are appreciating this online ministry and supporting it by texting 73256 with the message "Give to UU," or by giving on our website. Your gifts help us continue to provide this ministry. We also share the plate with an organization each month. The nonprofit Nehemiah Project is our summer Share the Plate recipient. With 2 facilities in Milwaukee, the Nehemiah Project works with teens and young men, 13 to 20 years old, who have served their sentence and are preparing to return to their families. Its mission is to promote the physical and emotional well-being of youth through psychological, educational, leadership, and transitional living services in a residential community. They accept clothing items, furniture, financial donations, and offer volunteer opportunities. To make a donation directly to the Nehemiah Project, please visit their website. They also accept donations over the phone. You can see all these options on your screen now, and they will live on in the YouTube comments section of this video after worship is over. Thank you so much for giving, right now, or when you come back later. Your support keeps us and our community partners going. Thank you.
Our closing words today are by Tom Shady. My friends, there is a power at work in the universe. It works through human hands, but it was not made by human hands. It is a creative, sustaining, and transforming power, and we can trust that power with our lives. It will sustain us whenever we take a stand on the side of love, whenever we take a stand for peace and justice, whenever we take a risk. Trust in that power. We are, together, held by that power. Go in peace.
We are going, heaven knows where we are going. We know within, and we will get there. Heaven knows how we will get there, but we know we will. Whoa, yeah, yeah. Whoa, yeah, yeah. Whoa, yeah, yeah. Whoa, yeah, yeah. Whoa, yeah, yeah.